do you think that by nature, some people should just be priced out of advanced fertility, for instance? It seems that's what we have with regards to everything else, right? So you can't drive a Ferrari because you can't afford a Ferrari. Now, is it okay for the market to shape a similar relationship to giving birth to and raising children?
In any system, if you maximize one component, in this case, in a society, if you maximize one individual, that could come at a huge cost to the system.
Welcome back to Radius of Reason, a lowbrow podcast about highbrow topics. We like to discuss politics, science, philosophy, and other things that cause us existential dread. My name is Andrey. I'm joined by Levon, my co-host.
Hello.
It's great to be with you. This is episode 20. Now, let me ask you something. Talk about this stuff a lot, but really, how do you think the world's going to end? How is our civilization on this planet going to die out? Is it war? Is it climate change? Is it because we're not having enough sex? What do you think?
It's definitely because we're not fucking enough. At least the Chinese, for sure. Because what we've seen here in recent studies is China's population is going to be cut in half by the year 2050. And they're not the only Asian country that's suffering. Obviously, Japan and Korea in particular are really, really suffering.
Yeah.
There's a crazy stat about Korea's birth rate being at a 0.8, which to us normal people is like, what does 0.8 mean? Well, let me put it into context. A birth rate of 1.9 will have your population halved in every 500 years.
Right.
A birth rate of 1.8 will be every 250 years. So all you have to do is do the math and to see like how fucked Koreans are.
Yeah, it's like the South Korean civilization is on track to essentially become extinct in the next couple hundred years unless something serious changes. Now, but this isn't just East Asia that's undergoing these huge shifts. I mean, even here in the United States, how many people do we know? And we're in our 30s.
Yeah.
We don't really know that many people that have, let alone one kid, but multiple children. And I think it's something people are becoming increasingly concerned about. It's nothing really new. You know, the United Nations has been ringing the bell on population decline since the 1970s. Some countries, again, are a little bit further ahead in the decline than others. But this is an issue that, just like climate change and thermonuclear war, is one of those factors that we have to grapple with as something that could potentially bring about the end of our civilization.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But real quick, I want to circle back to your point about, us being in our 30s and how many people we know that are childless. There's another crazy stat, which is apparently the case for all like developed countries. Mm-hmm. If you're a woman who reaches the age of 30 and you're childless, there's a 50% chance that you will remain childless.
And this isn't you just making this up.
No, this is an expert on population collapse had said this. I forgot his name, so whatever. But
yeah,
the point is, not just due to biological factors in terms of infertility, but due to the social circumstances in developed countries, due to the career paths that people take, also due to finding the right partner. Now we have dating apps and we have this kind of issue with just the paradox of choice, etc. These are all playing into a very interesting dynamic that's occurring, where birth rates are now at a critical juncture of being kind of not irreplaceable or what's the word I'm looking for here?
Sustaining or
yeah, sustaining. Let's just say that. Anyhow.
And, I think it's interesting because a lot of the maybe political groups that are discussing this outright tend to be from more conservative circles. Mm-hmm. And I think there is obviously the very, very racist kind of ultra right wing narrative about being replaced by certain ethnic groups. And we certainly saw that unfold in Charlottesville a couple years back when they had the Unite the Right rally, where the ultra right wing, the almost the neo-Nazi wing of American politics, and globally tends to espouse this kind of narrative. I think that there is a conversation also to be had from the other side of the spectrum, maybe from the political left in the United States, that can explore the fact of why individuals aren't having children necessarily. And you mentioned societal factors, right? I think that's a huge piece of what we're grappling with in the US, is that policy isn't really being shaped to encourage individuals to have children, right? The access to quality healthcare, to quality education, to financial stability, it's all very perilous in the US, I think, at this point. And nobody really wants to take the risk of having multiple children under circumstances that maybe aren't ideal. Now, I can already hear maybe my parents' generation saying, it's like, oh, well, we had you in like far more difficult circumstances. Right. But I think there is something about the general sense of instability and panic that a lot of individuals from our age group have about having children, especially when we're talking openly about things like climate change and the impacts that we're having on the
do you think the media's dooming of all these issues has contributed to that collective psychology and maybe hesitation to have kids?
I think it certainly plays a role into it. I think maybe the more like existential anxiety that we tend to feel does come as a consequence of constantly being hit with this information over and over again. I think there are other factors in play as well, where a lot of people from our generation had to witness our parents go through the 2008 recession, how a lot of families were left absolutely destitute in this country. So it's easy to attribute blame to a lot of different factors. I think that a lot of conservative arguments tend to leverage declining birth rates as an example of our culture has kind of evolved to sort of this point where we're straying further and further from God, right? Where we've left the sacred duties we have as people.
Oh no, that's the primary factor, man. Yeah. We are disobeying the Lord.
We are disobeying the Lord's calling, and the damn TikTok is making us have less sex. That being said, there are, I think, factors to consider in why people are having less children, but simultaneously, those who are taking it upon themselves to be the mantle of increasing our population, this kind of new form of, I guess the term would be natalism, this idea that, oh, we should be having a lot of children, is emerging in wealthier parts of our society to kind of counterbalance the population declines we're experiencing across the globe to a certain extent. And that's interesting and I think alarming too, to a certain extent.
And that is what we are going to discuss in this episode of Radius of Reason. But before we progress in this dialogue, we're going to ask you, the subscriber, to please hit the subscribe button, or not the subscriber, the listener, the viewer, to hit the subscribe button. This is we're gonna clip. Are we keeping this? Or are we getting? This is a gift to the viewers.
Humanizing us. We had some people express concern after our last episode that we're actually AI algorithms because we're so polished.
Hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button. Comment. And enjoy the show.
Yes, and be sure to follow us on Twitter as well, radius_of. Engage with us. Be great to talk to you. But if you criticize my sweaters, we're banned.
I enjoy the sweater criticism, so I encourage it. Okay, so let's kind of talk a little bit more about this kind of pro-natalism movement.
Yeah, and it's nothing new, right? It's, I think,
natalism is not a new thing, and being pro-natalist is not a new position, but in conjunction with the kind of Silicon Valley elites, right? You think there's something new happening?
I think just like Silicon Valley tends to repackage everything that already exists into something new and then sell it and market it to people. I think that's exactly what we're seeing emerge with quote unquote neonatalism. Again, the fact of living to have children, to reproduce, that's been something that has, I think, dominated the human condition forever. In the past, it's been because you need a lot of children to, first of all, replace all the ones that die, which is kind of sad. Then as I think our economies took off, you needed a lot of children to help work in the fields and then work in the factories. And I think the modern form of natalism really took off in the late 19th, early 20th century as a response to industrialization, where a lot of people did enter the workforce and spent less time working and having kids. So there was a wing of Christianity that started promoting something called the quiverful movement. The idea being the biblical reference to, your children are like arrows in your quiver, and they're going to protect you and they're going to help you survive in this world. But this movement took off in the late 19th, early 20th century. That was essentially a rejection of contraception and then birth control when it came up in the mid-century. And the ideas are very much similar to what we're going to talk about today, right? You should have children because that is your God-granted duty. It's your purpose to reproduce. And now, in response to, I think, greater conversation around these statistics of population decline, more and more wealthy elite, at least here in the United States, are publicly speaking out about their duty kind of reproduce and to have more children while the poor and working classes can't necessarily do so. I think the biggest icon of this is Elon Musk. He's spoken very openly about having 10 kids by this point, 2 of which he had through IVF with his secretary. He's had him with Grimes, with his first ex-wife. But he's all about this notion of, I have to reproduce because it's my duty. I'm wealthy. I have a high IQ. I have to reproduce. And that, I think, is where we start. Or
is he just insecure? He just wants to let people know that he fucks.
Yeah, well, I mean, what better way to let people know you fuck than having a bunch of kids?
Right.
Hey. But I think that point is actually pretty scary, is the fact that it starts wandering into the territory of eugenics to a certain extent. The idea that some people should reproduce versus others because some people produce superior genetics. And that's kind of the narrative that's taking shape in Silicon Valley, where a lot of these wealthier families see themselves as ultimate successes in the current socioeconomic system. Therefore, something must be intrinsically linked to their biology that gives
special.
Them the imperative.
They're special.
They're special.
You're just jealous you're not there.
I'm jealous that I'm not there. So I think that there's 2 separate conversations to be had. There is, as we always talk about, a question of policy, right? Where clearly something is going on at the level of the individual around the world where they're not feeling the pressure or the security or the stability to have children. Some countries have started moving towards natalist policy to help address these factors. It's things like in Finland that the government guarantees time off for mothers and fathers after a child is born. They guarantee placement in daycares, guarantee healthcare, things along those lines. And then there's also the market response that we're seeing in things like Silicon Valley, producing tech companies to make it possible to expand the window of fertility for men and women to have children safely in their 40s and 50s. Those are 2 parallel things, I think, that are going to lead to 2 separate outcomes. I personally think that policy approach is the greatest potential savior we have for reducing our demographic crisis that we're rapidly approaching. And I think the market approach is ultimately going to lead to what we'll talk about a little bit with neo-eugenics.
Well said. Yeah, dude. What do you want me to say, man? Like, what do I even say in response to that?
Even say to that?
Like, there's you're on point.
So I was saying all of that with the intention of asking you: do you think capitalism is capable of preventing the population collapse we're facing?
Yes. Maybe, actually. Maybe. Well, capitalism loves to solve problems.
Bunch of thirsty boys out there.
There's a bunch of thirsty men, and in some cases women
to the ladies,
who want to solve these problems and make a lot of money. So you can bet your ass there's going to be a lot of technology aimed at fertility. And I think we're going to see in Silicon Valley that attract a lot of venture capital.
Yeah, I think the stat I had here is that the fertility industry is expected to expand to be like $78 billion by 2025. So, I mean, they're trying.
And yeah, so I think in general, it's going to be easier for people to delay having kids and have some insurance plans basically for that. But that is not going to be sufficient to counteract the level of population decline that we're experiencing. But I want to kind of reverse the question and ask you, do we really need to avert this population collapse? Because when you have automation and AI coming to fruition, when AI is going to allow people to do one guy to do the work of 10 in white collars, at least in the white collar sector, eventually, that's going to hit all sectors. But is it actually a blessing in disguise to have a reduced population? Because what happens if you have millions of people without jobs, right? You're going to have a lot of political and societal instability. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, in my opinion, it's almost an easy way out of some of the problems we talked about in our last episode. In that AI, the absolute dumpster fire that the market is going to be after we introduce unrestricted AI, which is kind of, I think, the direction we're heading in right now, right? There's going to be no caps on it. There's going to be no attempts to protect the people that are going to be essentially developed out of their current jobs. So it does seem like a very easy solution is just to kind of let the population decrease so that we won't actually have to put any guardrails around tech. I also think that's like a batshit crazy way of thinking, that we should indeed have these conversations and figure out how can we wrangle in some of the worst elements of our economic system without resorting to like, like a certain percentage of the population is just going to never come to fruition. So I personally think that we should do everything in our power to maximize the survival of our civilizations, collective human civilization, right? And not speaking about the U.S. specifically. And I think as it stands, the market isn't really capable of doing that. Because you made a very interesting point about it's going to be easier with some of the research and investment that's happening into fertility studies. It's going to be easier for people to have families later in life. I think it's going to be easier for certain people to have families later in life. Because I think that's going to be a very cost restrictive, I don't even know what to call it, a therapy or a technology to implement. And it's going to ensure that only a select group of people are having families. Now, the question I have for you is, do you think that's ethical? Do you think that by nature, some people should just be priced out of advanced fertility, for instance? It seems that's what we have with regards to everything else, right? So you can't drive a Ferrari because you can't afford a Ferrari. Now, is it okay for the market to shape a similar relationship to giving birth to and raising children?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I think eventually, when you have genetic engineering that is restricted to the elite class, that can definitely be a problem. But I think simply, delaying having a family, that's more like a luxury that's maybe sometimes assumed, with being rich. That's kind of an assumption that we accept because they have all sorts of luxuries, right? If you're not rich, you might have to try to have a family earlier in life because you're not capable of affording all these different technologies and fertility options that are going to be available. It sucks. It's not fair, but that is capitalism. Like having more money affords you privileges, right? But do you think that this is going to be coupled with kind of this whole notion of designer babies and genetic engineering sooner than later? Like what are your thoughts on that?
I think 100%. And I think the technologies that are emerging out of a lot of this research is already moving in that direction, right? Kind of the study of embryos to figure out potential genetic manifestations, if indeed these are the embryos that are chosen for conceiving a child, right? So you can analyze an embryo to see if there's going to be a propensity as an adult for certain types of cancers, schizophrenia, for maybe certain behavioral difficulties. That's already, I mean, that's not even science fiction. That I think is being implemented to a certain extent right now.
Yep.
So I think that's exactly the path we're getting on, is this notion of a designer baby, that certain genes are more desirable than others, which to me, that just screams eugenics. Because the whole idea of something being more desirable than something else, you're already going to be like alienating an entire segment of
now eugenics is a broad notion though, right? Because ideally I think everyone would accept, like, hey, if I can screen for certain diseases that are like basically gonna potentially bound your child to like a lifetime of suffering, if I can screen for those and decide to not have children, or maybe somehow do a gene modification to prevent that disease from manifesting in my child, I mean, I feel like everyone would accept that. So that's one, eugenics light, I guess, interpretation of what could happen. Of course, then you have like the actual ability to potentially increase IQ if that was actually within reach. It's not at all right now. No. And it may not be for a very long time, even with an artificial general intelligence, because the thing is, like, the human body is a chaotic system. Right. It's very difficult to understand how those interactions take place. And also, intelligence isn't purely genetic, so it could probably only take you so far.
I think the facts are what they are, but I think on a social level, there already is a level of thought, again, from these more exclusive circles, at least here in the United States, that, oh, no, indeed, my genes are going to guarantee a higher level of humanity. And a great example of that is Jeffrey Epstein, where he had his ranch in rural New Mexico, where he wanted to have 20 women living there that he could just continuously get pregnant so that he could populate the world with offspring. Because he thought that based off of his success in life, whatever reason, CIA, Mossad, whatever, but he saw himself as a higher caliber of a human. Therefore, he should be the one that's populating the planet with offspring. And I mean, it's a batshit crazy approach, and I think Epstein was already kind of sort of encased on that path based off of how he treated people in general. But it's not that outlandish, because if you look at, Elon Musk's obsession with Genghis Khan, for instance, it kind of gives me a similar vibe, where this notion that everybody can trace like a certain percentage of their gene pool to Genghis Khan or something like that. I think if you already have the qualities of somebody who's going to be ruthless enough to lay off hundreds of people, to kind of tread over other people's shoulders to make your company successful, you're going to see yourself as like on a higher plane of existence than the average human. And you probably think that your genes are of a superior value. And I think the reason why there is kind of this burgeoning industry in Silicon Valley is specifically because of this more of elitist mindset. Somehow you're not just financially superior to somebody, you're genetically superior to them as well, even though if it's not grounded in.
Let me ask you a meta question here.
Oh.
So we know that people from, let's say, lower economic backgrounds tend to have more children. And maybe that could be due to some sort of subconscious process within them. Like, there's probably some sort of evolutionary explanation for why this is the case. And so for you to then criticize the elite class for wanting to have more children, but do so in a way that's explicit and conscious versus subconscious, is that like a fair criticism? Because if at the end of the day, that all stems to some extent, from biology. I mean, we can talk about free will or not, but is it like, just because it's expressed in a different way, but it achieves the same result? Because again, like people from lower economic backgrounds, the fact of the matter is they are having more kids,
Sure.
right? And does it matter if they're not saying that their genes are better?
That's a valid point. I do think it matters specifically because the exclusivity that's built up around integrating technology into the fertility process, it's coming from the same pools of people that are making it very, very hard from a policy standpoint to pass laws that would enable universal health care for them. They're actively lobbying against these things. They're actively damaging political movements that could maximize these sorts of benefits for the bulk of the population, right? It is seen as an exclusive thing, and I think that's the biggest difference, is that when a poor family has a few children, they're not excluding other poor families from doing so. And they're not necessarily thinking about it as like, okay, well, I should be the one having children because I'm the best, example of humanity. I think it is an alarming and a pretty dangerous thing when you have groups of people that see it as their duty to populate the planet because they are the superior ones. I think that thought process is everything, to answer your question. It is, I think once you start seeing yourself as, even if it's not grounded in reality, but you're seeing yourself as a superior genetic specimen, that in itself is a dangerous thing. Because realistically, like, we're not.
That's, kind of a prelude to like a Holocaust scenario.
Well, not even just a prelude. I think it's perfectly in line with those sorts of... And let me ask you this question. Is the notion of gene tailoring, or maybe recognition of certain genes being better than others, is that a dangerous precedent for humanity?
So I think we already... I think intuitively humans already recognize certain traits are better. I think all else being equal, we would prefer, say, our child to be more intelligent. All else being equal. So like we do already make that kind of assumption that intelligence, for example, is a desirable quality. In the same way, like having smooth skin versus like really maybe messed up skin or a bunch of moles on your face or something, like those are, so we already kind of have like a gene quality detection system that's innately built. I mean, it's kind of what's necessary when it comes to reproduction. When it comes to selecting a mate, you're always making that calculation. Like, why did you choose your particular mate, right? Well, you assess their gene quality.
Subconsciously. Okay, so let me rephrase this question. Is kind of this neonatalism approach we're talking about, and I think, again, we're differentiating natalism as it comes maybe throughout history with its common associations with religious imperative. I think neonatalism, to me, is something that's inherently tied with technology, right? So is neonatalism a logical continuation of evolutionary psychology?
Or biology. Yeah.
But even psychology.
When you say logical,
logical continuation. We're like,
well, we can sit here all day and try to figure out, well, what's natural and what isn't. Like, what are we going to define as natural and what isn't? Like, on some level, you can say this is just simply a natural expression of evolution, the course of evolution, where we've developed these very large brains and we're able to actually do some genetic engineering. And so, like, we're going to do it and we're going to see what happens. So I think in that sense, it is part of the evolutionary path that we're on. But I also do think, like, even if you have this scenario where you've basically got two groups, right? Like in the film Gattaca, you've got the valids, which are the genetically modified people, the superhumans, and then you've got the invalids, the people that never received any genetic modification. Even if you have that condition, you're still going to have evolution act on those groups. And it's possible that the genetic engineering, first of all, it's entirely possible that we get it wrong and people get fucked up.
Well, yeah.
And everyone's scared shitless of ever doing that again. That could happen. It's also possible that people start to select for very similar genes, which reduces genetic diversity, which predisposes to that group to more diseases and reduces their kind of immune capabilities as a group.
We'll just be like a giant planet of like Habsburg emperors. Like, have you seen the paintings of the inbred like Spanish kings who like their tongues don't fit in their mouths because they're so like.
But yeah, no, that is something that, I mean, you would think they would be smart enough to avoid if they're doing genetic engineering.
Amazing. Like, we just assume that genetic engineering, we're all gonna be like a bunch of like awesome, like hyper intelligent tech wizards, but in reality we're just inbred. Like, we're all
just inbred.
We're just
so that is one possibility. And regardless, like, there could be all sorts of things that are completely unforeseen. Again, like, we don't really understand all these genetic interactions. We don't really know in the long term what these effects are going to be, not just on the individual, but through multiple generations in a society. That is a question that we simply don't have any tools or methodology to figure out how to even begin tackling. Like, we just don't know. You could have some really detrimental things happen to genetically engineered societies. I would be, honestly, even if I was in Silicon Valley and Elon Musk was my best friend, I would be terrified in trying to do any sort of genetic engineering, anything other than like screening for diseases. Like, I would, if I had the financial capability and I was having kids, I would absolutely screen for genetic issues, right? I mean, why wouldn't you?
Right.
To me, it seems like the moral imperative to do so.
Hang on, let's double click on that really quick. So, if you have the ability to do so, is it in fact like a civilizational imperative for you to ensure that your offspring is not going to have certain conditions, or maybe a propensity for a certain condition?
I think when it comes to disease and suffering, it's something we absolutely want to avoid. Of course, we still want to have confidence that these technologies don't lead to other issues.
Right.
And that's a different question as well.
And I think at this point, the technology is elementary in the sense that it is strictly detection. It's not modification, where, you know, if you have an embryo and you run a PGTP test on it, right? Which I referenced it earlier. It's essentially it's a genetic test for risks in embryos for disorders that can emerge later in life as adults. Things like schizophrenia, which starts manifesting a little bit later in life. So it's not like this genetic test is able to alter the gene. The idea is that if an embryo tests positive for it, it won't be used in an IVF treatment. It'll just be terminated. So that's the level of sophistication we're at, but it is still it's a level of control that maybe we haven't historically had. And back to the question of, if you have access to this technology, is it unethical for you not to do anything with it, essentially?
Yeah. No, I would say when it comes to just screening and detecting issues in your kids and trying to decide whether you should have kids if you've got a high chance of, you know, giving birth to someone with a crippling disease, like, absolutely it's a moral imperative to look at that and make a rational decision, and to avoid giving birth to people that are going to suffer. Like, to me, that seems like a no-brainer. But it gets just much more complicated when you look, 10, 20, 30 years down the line, and you have the designer babies issue of, well, I can make my kid 20% smarter if during pregnancy I take this pill or have this process done. Right? Like, then it's like, okay, and if that became cheap, let's just say in theory, would it then be unethical? And let's say insurance covered it, so there's no question about cost, right?
It's like ideal society.
Right. Would it then be unethical not to make your kid 20% smarter? Because think about it, then they're going to by virtue of not being 20% smarter than they would otherwise be, they're going to be at a massive disadvantage compared to other kids, which could lead to suffering.
We have our
right?
answers already before us with things like early vaccination for certain things. I think we would all agree that we're going into this territory. We would all agree that vaccinating your kids against things like smallpox and polio is probably the ethical thing to do.
Speak for yourself, you coastal elite.
Yes, yeah, precisely. A coastal elitism is shown. That being said, for the most part, barring outliers, we've accepted that as the ethical thing to do. In fact, it would be unethical not to give your kids the tools that are available right now to deal with very serious illnesses, right? So I think, like the path of logic is already there, where if there is like some magical pill that increases IQ by like 15 points or something like that, which I feel like was a very low IQ statement I just made. But yeah, of course you'd take it. And I think the parallel that I want to draw is during the Holocaust.
Okay.
A huge driving force of the Holocaust, and this is in relation to the extermination of Jews and also the other groups that the Nazis targeted, communists, LGBTQ plus, with chromosomal abnormalities and whatnot. Is that not essentially the same thing that you're doing, just at the very early, like, embryonic stage, right? Where the horror of the Holocaust is that there was an institution that was deciding what can and cannot live.
Right. After people are born, then that decision was being made, and it manifests into a very cruel process and event, right? But you're saying we're essentially doing the same thing with genetic.
I'm asking.
I think in principle, you are filtering. In principle, it's the same thing. It's a filtering mechanism, right? But of course, it's not conscious entities that are now suffering. It's just you're making
cells.
Yeah, it's so. I think unless someone subscribes to some sort of panpsychism viewpoint where everything has an innate consciousness and his ability to suffer or something, I think there is a critical distinction between those. I think that the idea is the same, but in practice, obviously, it's much better to do it before people are born than after the fact. So I think. But I just think I guess the bigger problem though I sense that you're trying to get at something more fundamental, more deep than what we've discussed so far, because at some point the elite class, as they continue to genetically modify themselves, they will have access to the newest technologies. At some point maybe they reach a sort of genetic escape velocity where they do become, so much more superior to the have-nots. And then you have a sort of dualistic class system, which we already sort of have but it would go beyond economics, right? It would go beyond, it would go beyond lifestyle. It would go beyond fame. It would be something we've never seen in the history of humanity. We would have essentially two different species of human.
Right. No, right? And I think, I don't know the correct historical era, but when you still had like the Neanderthals versus our immediate ancestors, right? Where you almost had two different types of humanity. This is like such a Joe Rogan moment. God.
No, this is important though.
Yeah, but there were multiple types of humans, and then one type ultimately succeeded based off of Rotor, right? And I think you're painting a very accurate picture, is that we have divisions in our society right now on like a social and economical level, right? Based off of an income that you're born into, you're already X amount of steps ahead of somebody who's born into a poor family. Now, we can find ways to balance it out. And of affirmative action policies and scholarships, and like we can still manage the differences as best as possible now. Some would argue not enough, but the tools are there. But I like what you're describing in that the inequities we have now would be established at a genetic level where you almost wouldn't even be able to compete with somebody that's born into a certain class of society because they'll just be that much better at surviving an illness. Or
and I'm also concerned about what we know about human psychology. We know that we're insanely tribal, and we know that we can barely handle the level of tribalism we see today based on differences that are in many cases very artificial or petty or something that shouldn't be as divisive as it seems to be. If we're being rational, good human beings. But when you have substantial genetic differences and you see the divergence that might take place, I mean, I don't know if we can fathom the level of tribalism that would take place in that society, right? And like you alluded to in our past, when you had Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, I mean, what happened, right? They weren't that much different. I mean, they were different, but they weren't that much different.
And yet, where are the Neanderthals now?
Yeah. And so I do think if that divergence continues and this gap gets large enough between the elite modified valids and then the unmodified invalids, right? At some point, the value of the invalids is going to be akin to like chimps compared to human beings. Like, honestly, that's where it could go. Especially if you combine this thought experiment with where we might go with artificial general intelligence.
Right. And
if those people if they're the ones who own the artificial general intelligence, if they own the big AI companies, and people in those circles are going to have such a huge advantage, I think they're going to have all the power. Like it's just, yeah, I mean, it's potentially a very grim future that this could lead to.
Like what we're getting at here, the fact that we are seeing the seeds of that society start to be planted right now, where we have a recognized crisis, in addition to all the other factors that are threatening humanity. We do have a very real demographic crisis that is shaping up. We've talked about it as a civilization. We've addressed it since, it sounds like the 70s, when the bell started to be rung, by the United Nations about this. And now it's entering more and more into maybe a level of popular understanding that two dudes at the podcast are all of a sudden talking about. So it's a recognized issue we have. And it seems that the solution that's emerging to it is less about stabilizing and reforming society to enable everybody to collectively participate in a level of population resurgence, allow everybody to fuck freely or whatever. But based off of how the guardrails of a current civilization, a certain percentage of society is starting to address this or think about it, right? And we'll have the resources to access the technologies that will enable greater birth rates and healthier children. So that's kind of the direction we're heading in. I think we've painted a pretty dark scenario. But do you feel like on the trajectory we're at right now, that's exactly what we're heading to? That's not unreasonable to think that with the current arrangement of things, that's exactly what the situation we're going to do.
I mean, I think it's definitely a possibility. I don't think it's certain that is going to be the case, or I don't even necessarily think it's like a high probability that it will be the case, but it's a concrete possibility. Because you look at other variables. I mean, you look at like another, medical technology, anti-aging, right? There's been a lot of groundbreaking research in that field, and what happens when you can just live indefinitely, right? What happens when that reaches escape velocity and you're extending people's lives by 10, 20 years, and then another 5, 10 years by another 40, 60 years, and then all of a sudden people that are alive today are going to potentially be able to live forever, barring any crazy accident, right? When you're able to have technology that, you know, isn't just applied to a fetus, but applied to you now to get rid of diseases that prevent you from aging. That's just one thing that would completely reshape society and that hypothetical future case where you have this elite class. Now, you might have a different elite class that never dies, right? And that's also a possibility. But like, there's so many interconnected variables that, of course, like, this is an impossible thing to confidently assert. Like, yeah, we're going to have an elite genetically modified class. They might also, you know, society might also just self-implode from people. Right. Like, anti-aging pills, for example, could become so cheap that you have societal collapse happen because there's a bunch of fucking old people that have technically reached retirement age and now are like living off 65. And they don't want to have kids, and so there's nobody working. Like, I mean, who the fuck knows? But no, I think anytime you make distinctions between people, you're exacerbating a sort of tribalism. And we know from many conversations we've had and from basic research on the topic that tribalism reduces empathy in individuals, right? Like, you see them as less valuable. That's why you're able to go to war, right? Between the different tribes. You're able to kill another human being and not feel too bad about it, right?
You're trying to say something?
No.
Okay.
I'm giving you the deaths there. Right. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly where I was going with this. I think I sort of somehow answered your question.
I see your point. And I think that it is important to note that the certainty of anything in this conversation is difficult to imagine, because who could have predicted how our society evolved in the past 100 years, right?
Oh, nobody predicted the internet, for example, exactly. Right? If you were in the 1950s, your idea of the future was missing the most critical component of the future.
But the baseline infrastructure was already emerging in that mass communication was slowly becoming a thing. And like, something was taking shape that you can kind of trace the logical evolution of the internet. And I think if we have a baseline of problem,
that's a good point. Yeah.
that we're going to be addressing. And I think at some point, this is going to become more and more of an issue. I mean, we talked about that the population of South Korea is going to start experiencing some very difficult statistical shifts in even 100 years. So there's going to have to be some sort of conversation or solution that's offered up to this discerning. I mean, maybe we'll start cloning people. Who knows? But what alarms me, and just like we had in our conversation on last episode 19 about artificial intelligence, what alarms me is that nothing about our current socioeconomic and political arrangement suggests any other pathway that could be taken except, you know, the exclusivity of some of these products, right?
Well, it's our political system is so slow to react that you just have a scenario where anything goes that the free market will reward. Right?
And it sounds like based off of the projections for how much money there is to be made off of this sort of tech fertility industry, that's exactly the direction the market is heading in.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the power of pharmaceutical industry now,
yes,
then we extrapolate more that or even more power to these fertility companies, anti-aging companies, etc. Yeah, it's.
So let me ask you a meta question: is to struggle with maybe conditions or difficulties that were almost guaranteed based off of how you were born, and to eventually die, is that what it defines to be? As in, if you start programming some of these things out, right, is it making you less of a human because you're no longer facing some of these factors of adversity?
Yeah, I think that is what is part of being human. I think it's what defines the best people, right, that exist in our society. And I don't mind using that term, like best people, because, I mean, think about someone who has had no adversity in their life. It's very difficult to imagine that they have had the full human experience, that they can fully appreciate things that someone who has gone through adversity does appreciate. So I do think to be robustly human, you need to overcome adversity. Having said that, the new age of human life that is coming could pose its own adversities that we're not privy to now. And it may not include, adversities in terms of health issues, diseases, and whatnot. So I don't think these genetic improvements are necessarily going to dehumanize us, but they do run the same risk of making us more complacent with they run the same risk that we see now in modern day society, where we're too comfortable, right? Like where we don't have to go hunt our food, right? So like modern day society has that issue. It's the same question applied to modern day society compared to like Neanderthal times, right? So we're still human, but we're a very different human.
Like our humans were cavemen.
But you know what I mean? Like our day-to-day life is just so much.
Well, it's alien to whatever.
Alien. And so in the same way, this kind of future genetically modified human life is also going to be vastly different and have its own issues. And I do think. I don't think not having disease is going to be the big issue, but I mean, the movie Gattaca, honestly, again, to go back to that film, it illustrates, like some of those key issues where, like, how do you, if everyone has access to genetic modification, mm-hmm. at some point you're going to converge on like the best set of genes, right? There's going to be little distinction between individuals. Now, we already talked about like the biological implications of that, which could be devastating if they don't develop other mechanisms to address those issues. But just think about it from a purely cultural standpoint and from the culture of like status and just human to human interaction. Like, you're losing a lot of novelty by converging on a set of genes. I'm not saying there's only going to be one set of genes, but there's going to be a smaller number of unique profiles.
And it's almost curious as to what is going to make the short list of like desirable genes versus not. Where it's like, oh.
Well, let's say it turns out, because like blue eyes are like very much in demand in society, right? And look, a lot of people, yes, you can pat yourself on the back.
I did all the work, yeah.
But like, if it turns out in 200 years, you know what? Like, that's the best eye color. Like, we're just gonna give everyone
blue eyes.
Blue eyes, okay. That's fine, but now everyone has blue eyes and no one has all of a sudden eye color is irrelevant. By giving everyone,
it's going to cause like almost like a fad shift where like somebody's going to have brown eyes and then everybody's like, oh shit.
Yeah, it might reverse. Yeah. So maybe that's the solution. You're in perpetual it's like a sinusoidal function.
It's a market force to genetics.
So that's potentially what could happen. But I don't know. I just feel like, I mean, what happens when everyone's 200 IQ? When everyone has the perfect level of conscientiousness and empathy, and when you're trying to find a mate, the only thing different is brown eyes versus blue eyes. Like, at what, like, where, like, part of the richness of human life is the uncertainty,
The variety.
But when everything is certain and when there is no variety, what differentiates humans from pure algorithms, right? Input, output in a very predictable fashion. That is a terrifying future. And to me, it seems like, as much as, I'm in favor of rationalism, as much as, I think technology is very fascinating and interesting and has obviously many benefits to society. That's a very terrifying scenario, I think.
It removes the certain elements of chaos that I think dictate and shape our species. And I think you hit a very valid point where once you start removing these things and you start removing the variety of human existence, you are essentially producing something that is kind of separate. And
do you think my premise is valid, though?
Yeah.
That if you are going to have genetic engineering, that it will converge on less variety in terms of the gene pool.
I do. I think, and the saddest thing is, I think it's going to be so boring. It's going to be the most like milk toast. Okay, fine. Like Jeff Bezos is like the superior entity because he made the most money in our current system. So let's just program ourselves to be like Jeff Bezos.
Well, this actually makes me think of another question real quick. We are assuming that people will even converge on what they think is preferable. Like, we're assuming that we will know what's actually better. But like, let's look at intelligence, for example. Earlier we talked about, well, it seems like innate that we prefer intelligence. Of course, there's different types of intelligences, and if you select for one type, you might
lose the other.
So that's kind of a black box that we're not sure of. But if you have, it's possible that, in any system, if you maximize one component, in this case, in a society, if you maximize one individual, that could come at a huge cost to the system. So even though each individual could be maximized, what happens to the system when everyone's a genius and everyone has, super amount of conscientiousness, but at a group level, you don't have the people that, want to do other functions. Let's say they don't want to go into healthcare to care for people. They don't have the same level of creativity, maybe. I know some people say intelligence is related to creativity, but again, intelligence being a broad term, it's kind of hard to even talk about this. But there's all these unintended consequences, and we know from evolutionary psychology and game theory, evolutionary biology in general, that there is a phenomenon called group selection, where evolutionary forces act on groups themselves and not just individuals. And they can end up also affecting, what happens to the individuals within the groups as well, in terms of their genetic predispositions and how they get shaped. For example, if you have a society with, again, 100 people and only 2 are psychopaths, that might be a good balance. Unless you're in a place where there's a lot of war, maybe you want more psychopaths because they're going to be better at killing the opposition. They might be better aggressive leaders for that particular time. Like, you're always in flux. Maybe in a more stable time period, you want very minimal psychopaths in your society, right?
And if you start coding genetics, you will lose the variance. And you'll just have, everybody wants their kid to be like Napoleon Bonaparte. But if you just have like a population full of Napoleons, like, that's going to be a completely dysfunctional society.
Yep.
And that introduces like the Aldous Huxley approach of Brave New World, where you have tiered, you sort of artificially replicate the variations in society by creating a very rigid hierarchy of like genetic modification. So inevitably some people are going to have to be coded to be like the lowest rungs of society because you need them in order to even justify the existence of the higher rung. Shit.
Yeah, it's fucking nuts.
Okay, well, do you think in your lifetime, let's say we discuss some of the technology that's accessible right now, do you think that you would be okay in using things like embryonic testing to determine not just like genetic disorders that could exist at birth, but propensity for things down the line. Is that something that you would be comfortable in introducing into your thought process?
I think probably. I would certainly look into it more myself. I haven't really done like the most research on it per se, but I think I would, because if you, just imagine you have a child and they have a crippling disease. And to think that you could have prevented that, but you didn't. Like that is a recipe for lifetime anguish.
It is.
So, yeah, I think we've been we doom a lot. We're very alarmist. We love to jerk each other off over
absolutely
over all these existential issues. But this is, in this one narrow case, if you think about it, like that is such a wonderful benefit of technology. Like that's something you have to respect. You have to be kind of fair when you're criticizing technology, because that's fucking insane.
Yeah.
To be able to do that.
I can definitely see the utility of it if you have a history of a certain disease in your family and you're able to predict that, in my family, for instance, we have a lot of strokes. And if you can somehow identify within an embryo whatever like genetic sequence that's going to contribute to that propensity, and you could see it, and then at this point right now your only option would be to just not use that embryo. But yeah, like guaranteeing that a kid won't have a propensity for strokes, I think that's something that everybody would agree is a positive thing. And even the elimination of certain, oh boy, here we go, the elimination of certain diseases, maybe that's worth thinking about as well. But I do still always come back to the point that I think this is like such a lazy approach. Like, instead of creating a more equitable, just, healthy society from a policy standpoint, we're just going to create a technology that can like eliminate certain elements of
it does, at least at this point, seem like a band-aid to a much bigger issue. I do agree with that, and maybe that's an unintended, or really an issue that we haven't explored a whole lot, is what impact will that have on these other societal issues, right? Where do they get swept under the rug because we have this kind of band-aid that seems to work just to hold things up?
Right. And we started the show off by discussing the various crises humanity faces, just because we're going to be able to genetically code our way out of schizophrenia. It doesn't mean that we're going to resolve the ultimate looming climate catastrophe we're facing. It's like, oh, sick, we have all these like amazing genius IQ individuals at a certain percentage of our population, but they're just as fucked as the rest of us because sea levels are rising and we can't cope with that, unless they're the ones that are going to think of the solution.
Think their way through it. But that'll probably happen too late, is my guess.
The funniest thing to me is that a lot of the personalities that are leading the public discourse on this, people like Elon Musk, objectively speaking, they view themselves as like really hot shit, but in reality they're like cringe as fuck. And if they're the ones that are like, oh yeah, we're going to produce like the perfect specimens of children, and it's just like our elite class is going to be continuously just like the most cringe, like.
Well, there's one thing that I don't know if genetic engineering can solve, and it's human propensity to delude themselves.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so that's,
you just create a bunch of really humble, high IQ people, and just. But then it's going to be grounded in like self-criticism and
self-loathing.
A bunch of geniuses that don't know their geniuses. Just.
Well, yeah, crazy things happening in the world.
Always.
And so much more to be explored. We're going to have a lot more AI content.
Thank you to all of you who have joined us recently. We are now at 101 YouTube subscribers. That's a big deal for us. Huge milestone.
20th episode as well. So
20th episode, I think statistically speaking, we've outlived a lot of other podcasts.
I think 99% of other podcasts.
Hell yeah.
So
continue to engage with us. We love hearing from you. Like and subscribe.
Especially if you've made it all the way through the episode.
Yes.
And you still haven't hit the subscribe button. What are you doing? Reach out to us on Twitter, _of.
Awesome Twitter handle. And stay on top of it, folks. Keep watching, keep listening.
Have a blessed day.
Blessed day.
Children of God.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.